that will just fix you. Yeah, it's
Yes,
not, it's not a broken arm.
yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
that's, there's a lot of talk about how um, multicultural people, multicultural communities actually don't access professional mental health support in Australia. And I find that to be a very one-dimensional argument.
Mm-hmm.
What you're not understanding when you make that statement is that for a lot of multicultural communities, like I said earlier, they might not even be aware that professional support is an actual thing, that therapy is an actual thing they can go to, that a therapist is a professional they can go and talk to. But apart from that, in a lot of communities, help seeking does not look like the highly individualized process of going to therapy that is normalized in white Western cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Help seeking looks like talking to your parents or aunties and uncles. Help seeking looks like going over to your friend's house and, eating a homemade meal there. Help
Mm-hmm.
seeking looks like staying within your community and working towards a community based goal rather
Mm-hmm.
than an individualistic goal. So even the process of help seeking is not the same. They might not even know that this process exists. So before we make those kind of statements that, oh, well, Indian people never come to therapy or Asian Australians never show up in therapy, these are things that we should actually be aware of, that from a policy perspective, from a systemic perspective, what are we missing out on?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And I think that's where you're right. It's because there's a difference in the type of culture. It's individualistic versus collectivistic culture.
Mm,
And one thing I've sort of started observing is that when I'm even in working with clients, some it's just working with people around them, the social support is, it's just so helpful. You're not working with a client just isolated in that, as one person. It's always the dynamic. And it's not just, oh, you have symptoms, we'll do CBT and you're good to go. It's not like that. It's everything. It's the environment, right?
absolutely, yes. And, a lot of my colleagues would be um, a bit flustered or surprised when they would be working with clients from who are BIPOC or from other cultures, and their parents would be the ones dropping them off to therapy and picking them up and checking in with the psychologist after the session. That, oh, how do you think my daughter's going? How do you think my son is going? And they would be like, oh no, professional boundaries, like privacy and confidentiality. It is so hard for them to understand that for a young person who's living at home with their parents, and the
Yeah.
parents are actually their support people, or they have friends who are their support people. They talk to their cousins every night, for example. For those people, like you said, those embedded social supports and working with all of them is so important. And your client should be the one leading that process. I would
Exactly.
really, realistically want that to happen, but we need to educate them that, yeah, it's actually okay to seek social supports.
That's actually good. That's the word I was thinking about. Education. It's that the education to not only with the client but also the people, especially around them, but especially if it's a young person, right? Of course, keeping all the ethics and everything in check, but that's so important, right? To have that dynamic, because that's culturally responsive practice, because that's the culture of
Exactly.
the
And
family.
yes, and they live within that culture, whether we like it or not. They live within that family environment, and we might not necessarily agree with them, or we might never have heard certain cultural aspects, but
Mm.
all of this contributes to who they are as a person.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, that's
Mm.
very fascinating because it's so important to keep these things in mind when you're working with them.
Yes, and the same applies to communities as well. A lot of communities, they really idealize certain people, or
Mm,
want to follow their advice
mm,
and things like that. And sometimes that advice may be really great advice, and sometimes it's not so great. But that's the way certain communities function. So you really have to find ways to work with the culture of that community. You have to find ways to work that suit that community, that suit that person. And one of the best ways to work is to be led by those values. What does this person really value? What does this community really value? If they value expertise, then we educate them and tell them that, look, I'm telling you this because I'm the expert in this field, but you are the expert in making decisions for yourself. So come along with me in this journey and let's discover this together. Or if they value information sharing, then you tell them, okay, so what would this look like? How would we actually share this information with other people in your community? How would we actually help you feel like you are driving this process? So you have to be understanding of what really drives people and communities, and that will help you create these inroads and create those shifts you want to create. But education is like, you can't get anything done without creating education, without creating awareness. It's so important to keep talking about these things. I get a lot of comments about, oh, your family must be really progressive. They allowed you, like allowed in quotes, to migrate to another country. Or, oh, your parents, how are they comfortable with you living all by yourself in a different country, or things like that. And I would tell people that, you know what, I'm willing to put my story out there and educate you for this purpose, but I will tell them, I can start again if that is too
No,
loud.
no,
I don't know if you can hear that, but
no, I
you
can't.
might have to cut this part out or edit this part out. But going back to what I was saying, it isn't just that I came out here and my family has been forced to be comfortable with that. It isn't that my family was just born really progressive and educated. No, this is because there's constant communication and dialogue between myself and my parents, between myself and my family unit. And imagine if you could do that with communities as a whole. Imagine if there is intercommunity dialogue, intergenerational dialogue in communities where young people are able to express to older generations that this is what mental health looks like. These are the pressures that we face. These are the ways we're using technology for ourselves. And if other generations could communicate with us and tell us how difficult it was for them to come here and survive as migrants, or the kind of trauma and displacement that they have faced, and how that has shaped their personalities, how that has shaped things like the scarcity mindset that you see so often in migrants, and older migrants especially, or the differences in values
Mm,
that you see within them, which causes a lot of intergenerational distancing in families.
mm, mm,
So
mm.
there needs to be that transparent, open communication and dialogue. And sometimes mental health clinicians are in the position of being able to facilitate that.
That's right. Yeah. Actually, that's fascinating. I would love to know more about the scarcity mindset. Walk me through that.
For a lot of communities who end up moving to other places geographically, who migrate, who seek asylum in other countries, like I was saying earlier, many of them are migrants by choice, many of them are not.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of whether you're a migrant by choice or not, if you're from a different culture and you move as a person from a minority culture to a majoritarian culture that's very different to yours, that acculturated stress, that pressure to assimilate, all of those things can make it so difficult. You can constantly feel like you're in survival mode, like your income is threatened, like you don't have access to a lot of resources, you don't have access to a lot of supports anymore. And for very real reasons, people tend to think that resources are limited because either in their countries of origin, those resources were really limited in terms of economic access or access to food. So they might have gone through poverty, they might have gone through caste based discrimination or color based, community based discrimination, religious persecution. Safety for them in so many different forms would have been a scarce resource. So when they move to another culture where safety might be more easily accessible, just because of the mistrust and abuse that they have faced and the mistrust they carry within them, it can be really hard to imagine that you have access to safety. And guess what? A lot of people experience discrimination. A lot of people experience systemic harm, which validates the fact that you don't have access to safety, which leads to that scarcity mindset. So you might see a lot of migrant communities, especially migrant generations of first generation migrants or previous generations of, who are now parents to second generation, um, other cultural people in Australia. You'll see that the scarcity mindset might actually be expressed through a hyperfixation on getting a high income job, or pressuring their children to earn really well or have like really big educational achievements, because that is a means to access safety, economic safety, or income safety, or honor safety in your community. So you will be held in high esteem if you have a job as as an engineer or as a doctor, rather than being a painter or being a tradie, because that's what the community has deemed honorable. So this is all about internal perception. And like I said, scarcity mindset can be validated by actual experiences people have. So it is a very real fear for a lot of people. And without educating them of the context of why we experience the scarcity mindset, you're not going to help them change it. Without them having the ability to express why it is that they feel this way, they're not going to be able to get that support from other generations who have been born and raised in a social and economic and political context that's very different to their parents or grandparents. And they do not experience the same lack of safety. They do not experience the same lack of access to resources, so lack of access to support, so lack of access to achievement. And so they're unable to understand why their parents or grandparents, why other members of their family act the way they do. And this is why we
Right.
need that intercultural dialogue as well to fix all of these little problems we face.
Got it. So it's not only about educating the previous generation, but more also about, okay, where these sort of schemas and this thought process is coming
Mm-hmm.
from to the younger generations, right?
Yes.
To create a separation between, it's, yeah, to just create a separation, I guess, at the end of the day, where they can challenge the intergenerational trauma rather
Mm-hmm.
than feel stuck within it. Because this is what it
Yes.
sounds like, intergenerational trauma.
Yes. And sometimes they feel stuck within it. Sometimes they ostracize themselves
Mm,
because they cannot relate. They just
mm,
cannot relate to, the culture or the values and belief systems that their parents subscribe to. And so they push themselves further away from that and de identify themselves from, say, the culture or ethnicity or religion that their family might belong to or the rest of the community might belong to. And that process can be really hard as well, because you're isolating yourself from one potential source of support. And that pressure to assimilate actually becomes even more compounded. A lot of people might, this is just a very widespread example, but I'm going to use it. A lot of people might just change their names or say that their preferred name is a more anglicized version of their name, and hope that that will mean they will get a little bit more buy-in with the majority culture. That'll mean that they're that tiny bit closer to the majority Aryan culture, but they shouldn't be experiencing that discrimination in the first place. And that still exists.
yeah, I think discrimination is just another huge topic that it's very, it's hidden. You don't really see it. That's what I've observed, but you feel it.
Uh, I actually don't agree that it is hidden because
Yeah, fair enough.
and perhaps it's just based on individuals' experiences as well. But unfortunately, I've experienced racism here, and so many people I know have. I've had clients tell me to my face, for example, that, oh, you're Indian, you won't understand my problems because I'm Australian. And, I've had people I work with tell me that, oh, you learned English really quickly for somebody who only
Okay.
migrated here two
Yeah.
years ago. And I'm there thinking, well, 250 years of colonization. That's why I speak English, not because I
Exactly.
migrated here.
And even I had the experience. I had an experience where it was actually a psychologist who said, "Oh, your English is so good." I think uh, I said because I've been learning English since I've been born. And I think that's one reason why I started this podcast is to actually just showcase that, yeah, it's this discrimination is not okay, but it feels the undermining of my culture is also not okay.
It isn't.
Yeah.
No,
And yeah.
undermining any culture isn't okay.
Yeah, and we need a space to highlight that. And I think there's a huge responsibility on our culture as well to
Mm,
be okay to speak up when things are not okay, to do things like education in terms of towards our community, learn that you have a choice
hmm.
for the most part, not always, but you do for the
Yeah.
most part. And if you don't, then working or making things that work for you, seeking the support if you don't have that, because support is available, because not only for migrants here, but even for my people back home and
Mm,
across the world, that, yeah, it's okay to speak up now.
yeah.
And we
And we
can.
should. Yeah.
Yeah,
And for some people
exactly.
it's not safe. I totally get where you're coming from when you say that, for some people it
Yeah, it's
absolutely
not
isn't
safe.
safe to
Yeah.
speak up, and it can actually put them in further
Yeah.
danger. And for the way I conceptualize that is that we have the privilege to be able to speak on behalf of those people. And if we have that privilege, we can use it. It is up to each individual to make that choice, whether you want to use it or not. And you might not be consistently able to use it, and that is totally understandable. But I choose to use that privilege to speak up against these things. So I might have little pockets of safety where I can lodge a complaint or, write to the Australian Human Rights Commission or come onto a podcast and talk about my experience. And I access those spaces and utilize those opportunities so that people who don't have access to those spaces, people who don't get those opportunities, hopefully at some point in time, their voices will also be heard through our voices being raised.
Exactly. Yeah. I I went to Surfers Paradise last week, and this is my first time I experienced racism, which is so fascinating. It was, we got in the tram there, and there was this. I think she was from a European background. I don't think she was, and there was this. You know, I've never experienced that before. So it was the first time, and it left me with a mark for like a couple of days where I went and sat next to her, but she didn't give me any space to sit. So
Mm,
her legs were crossed even on my seat. So I told her, "Excuse me, can you just move there?" Because there was no other space to sit. And she's like, "Oh no, I anyways don't want to sit here." And it was the first time I experienced it, and I for another 2 days I was still processing that experience. Even though I know that it's I have the knowledge, and I still took me so much time to process it. And I just can't imagine when you actually directly experience that, how hard it is, and people don't understand that, the feeling
yeah.
of, nah, you're nothing, like,
Being
just because I'm
dehumanized.
Indian,
Yes. And
which is,
that's
yeah.
that's at the core of it. And I'm sorry you had that experience,
Yeah.
and I'm always seeing you say that it was fascinating because you have that level of self-awareness and you're
Yeah.
introspecting and
Yeah.
processing it, but
Mhm.
it shouldn't have happened because at the
Yeah.
crux of it, at the very core of it, it's dehumanizing.
Absolutely right. It is right. And
Yeah.
another thing that I came across last week, actually, there's this Instagram page, and they put this reel of Indians. They were some something they were was protesting again in Uber. Something was
Mm,
going on in Melbourne. They were protesting. It was mostly Indian men protesting, right? I think they wanted a bigger raise. Something was going on. And the comments underneath that towards
Mm.
Indians, I was it it was just sad. It was, and it was a page here, like it was from Australia. It was some page, and it was things like, oh, you smell, go back to your country, there's not one other person, all Indians. And I, there was the only thing I could relate with those guys protesting was that they were Indian men. That's it, just Indian. Like, but I felt very unsafe just reading that. There are thousands of comments, thousands, like, and it was, and it's not okay. And I think that it did fuel my fire to further, like, okay, I really need to do this podcast where I can speak up about these things because it's not okay. It's just, and one, I'll forward it to you, and I'm thinking actually of like, oh, like actually, sharing it here. It's just
Mm.
sad to feel that, to read that about myself, about my culture.
Yeah, it is. And this is so prevalent on social media. And, this is why I said I don't agree with you that discrimination is hidden,
Yeah, it's not
because
hidden for
it
sure.
is out there. And these are the exact same people that you're riding the tram with, and who are your neighbors, and who go to school with your kids. These people are sometimes your boss, your teachers, your teachers, or your child's teachers, your professors at university, the people who are in control of whether you get granted a visa or not. And this is why systemic racism still exists, systemic discrimination still exists. And we have more than enough evidence and data, to show us that, yes, this
It's there.
actually is still continuing. And yet we have made very little progress in terms of changing how the systemic discrimination is disseminated through these systems and the impact it has on people.
Yeah,
Imagine, that impact, that one experience of a racist remark and racist behavior towards yourself. You took 2 days to process it. Now imagine that experience being multiplied manifold, thousands of times on an everyday basis, on people who are in jobs where they are facing this every day, who are in customer service jobs and who are getting those comments you saw on social media, which people feel emboldened to post because, they have that sense of separation because they're posting a comment online. When that separation goes away and
hmm.
you get told to your face that migrants are all illegal and they should be kicked out of the country, or you're only here to do the work that nobody else wants to do,
Or you're taking a
or
job, so you're the reason for the housing crisis. And
yes, as per usual, and there is so much educating and awareness creation and people from communities talking about this and making sure the systemic harm doesn't keep happening. And despite all of that, these attitudes and beliefs have not changed. In the majoritarian culture, they have not changed. And that is work that needs to happen at a much wider level than individual therapy.
you know what? This is something, I don't know if there's any evidence for this, but I'm just gonna say it, that I've noticed that there have been people who have been more accommodating, that are, not, let's say, Indian. No, even in India, to be honest, there is this kind of discrimination. But let's just not
Oh,
focus
of
on that.
course.
Yeah, yeah. But let's say here, right? It's not, for majority of the part. It's not actually because they think that we're equal, but it's more about, I don't want to get canceled. I don't want to say anything offensive. And I think that's the approach. I think that's a bit scary because it's really, at the end of the day, it's about literally feeling comfortable with each other as human beings.
Yes. And they're just looking for ways to protect themselves. Like you said, like,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to offend people, so I'm going to say what I think is the least offensive thing. And it's still offensive. But it's so difficult for them to take that responsibility for
Yeah.
their action. And when we personalize that responsibility, it becomes even harder. And everybody else, bystander effect takes over. They don't want to get involved because then they're risking, putting their own lack of knowledge in full public view. and getting cancelled, like you said, or being called offensive. So they don't want to do that either. So it's really, really hard to get people with privilege when they are protected by privilege. It's really hard to get those people's buy-in to address someone else's trauma.
Exactly. And that's why I also feel that it is also our responsibility as within our culture to, so it's almost feels like, oh, it's just accept me. I think it's now
Mm,
that because there's that as our culture, and I've noticed that, and inspiring Indians from India that you have autonomy.
mm,
Especially if you're there, there's discrimination, whatever is there within bounds of safety, keeping all that in mind. But yes, now we are also advanced culture. I wouldn't agree that we're any more a third world country at all.
no,
I've
and
been to
who
India.
makes the rules?
Yeah,
Who makes the rules that
exactly,
say, well, this culture isn't advanced?
exactly.
Countries have, your human development index factors, and they have their GDP and lots of things to measure who is doing better in which sphere. But who gets to call the shots, who gets to decide, who gets to medal and award themselves that my culture is more advanced than yours? What makes a culture more advanced than somebody else's? What makes, Australian indigenous cultures that don't have written language, for example, what makes those cultures less advanced than a foreign culture that has written language?
Yeah.
Who gets to say that this culture is more advanced, that culture isn't? Who gets to say that your culture is only advanced if you create aesthetically pleasing architecture?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
And people oftentimes don't want to admit that multiple things can be true at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That, India can be a culturally advanced country and an economically not so advanced country. And perhaps there are people there who are happy living how they are, despite being in what others might consider, developing country or a third world country or what have you. There are heaps of people there who are perfectly happy with their lives,
Yeah.
and there are just as many people who are facing all this discrimination, who are facing so many burdens, and who are unhappy. But migration out of the country is not going to solve their problems either.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
such a layered concept, and I
it
think
is.
that yeah, it helps really to understand what intersectionality is
Mm,
and understand that a person is not defined by just their skin color, by just their physical ability level, by just their nationality, by just the language they speak. That's not how it works. What we want to do is take that cognitive shortcut and at once stereotype people we see, because we love stereotyping as human beings. It's just easier for our brains to do that. It's just easier to put people into boxes and pretend that, okay, at least we are comfortable with what we think we know about this person.
mm,
But intersectionality is the concept that really helps you challenge
mm.
that idea and helps you look at people as the multitudes that they actually are.
In context.
In context, absolutely.
I think that's right. And there's so much burden on each and every one of us, not only clinician, but even as I think humans, to know everything about every culture, to be very
Yes.
sensitive, to do, and yeah, you have to be, but at the same time, I think the underlying concept of everything is curiosity and respect. I think
Yes.
that answers, if you have that, I think that
Mm.
I feel like I can take the burden off my thing and be like, yeah, I'm curious and respectful, and I think that's a good start for anything. Even if I want to learn about a culture it's not Indian or here, like just the way
Mm.
in order to assimilate here, I had to be curious and I had to be
Mm.
respectful. That was the step one of
Mm.
fitting in some aspect and assimilating and
Yes,
making friends and feeling comfortable and creating a safe space.
absolutely. And that respect should not be conditional.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be cancelled if I say this kind of. Yeah.
And I'll only respect Indians who are, so many shades lighter than this color of brown. Or I will only respect um, economic migrants and not asylum seekers, or I will only respect migrants who can speak English versus migrants who can't. So if that respect is conditional, it's worthless. It has to be about having that humility, having that respect, having that curiosity, and putting that into action, really living those values, not just containing those values and sitting on them, but really displaying those values through your actions, through your attitude, through your words. That is so important. It doesn't help for allies who hold these values dear. It doesn't help for them to be silent and inactive.
Mm. That's right, absolutely. And I think like these are the conversations. And I was, to be honest, a bit nervous about starting this podcast because it's a
Mm,
big step, but it was this importance of, it's important to bring on other people that can share their experience, that can not only, I'm not saying I'm better than anyone, but I want to learn myself. There's so many things I think I've just learned from you in the past 1 hour.
mm,
Even though I'm a psychologist and I'm Indian from the same city in India with you, but there's so much I've learned from you and so many things I didn't know, I don't know. And I think that's a curiosity that, we can hold for each
mm.
other to learn from each other. And no, and like I think one thing I love about my profession is that I just get to learn from my clients so much. And that's why I call this podcast In Between Tours, not only because I'm in between tours, like literally in two different continents, but also when I'm in sessions, I feel like I'm always in between different worlds. I'm like one after 1 hour, after every hour, I'm shifting worlds because it's so interesting to learn about so many people. And that's a curiosity.
Yes, and you are trusted with these stories and trusted with people's healing, with their past, with their, vulnerabilities
Yeah.
that they're willing to come and share with you in the interest of healing themselves or becoming better people or accessing certain things. So it is a really privileged position to hold. And I'm so
Yeah.
glad, like you said, you are starting this podcast. It is a big step for you. And I really admire your bravery as well, because it takes a lot to take time and space out of your life and carve out this separate voice that you're hoping a lot of people will hear and that will create ripples of change.
Mm.
So I'm really hoping you go very, very far with this podcast and get to talk to a lot of people and get to learn a lot from the process as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for your time. I think it's been, yeah, like I said, like every time I'm speaking to you, I'm learning something something new. And I would just like to know one thing. So, before we end, if there's one piece of um insight that you'd like to share about any part, of your life or just a learning and a lesson that
Mm.
could be helpful to even one listener, what would that be? And I'm putting you on the spot, I know that. Take your time to think about it.
Do you mean as a psychologist or as the
No,
person in
as
general?
a person, yeah.
I think it's okay to chase your dreams.
Mm,
They might not be what everyone else wants,
mm,
and they might not be what everyone else thinks is right for you,
mm,
but it's okay to try, and it's okay to give it your best shot. And sometimes you will fail, and that is okay too. Your self worth is not tied to whether your dreams were achievable or not, to what kind of job you do, to where you come from in the world, to what your name is, to what languages you speak. You're inherently worthy. And I really, really wish every person out there is able to sit with that and toy with that idea a bit and see whether it rings true for them and see if they can work towards that as well, believing that all of us have inherent worth.
yeah, that's beautiful. I feel a bit of a thing in my throat. And just don't cry on the camera.
because that's what a lot of the world around us teaches us, right? That you're only worthy if you do this,
Yeah.
that unless you achieve this, you're not worthy, and we are scared to do certain things.
Yeah.
And we've told our clients so many times, I'm sure you've told your clients, I've told my clients so many times, you are inherently worthy.
Yeah.
And just imagine if we all had access to that validation, wouldn't it be great?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just fascinating how just few words of encouragement, what that can do. And yeah, it's very, very, for me, that's one of the things that I learned when I was training. Just few words of encouragement can make huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope it makes a difference as well.
It does. And it will, absolutely. Thank you for your time. And I'm sure this is not the end of it. I will not let it be the end of it. And yeah, and I've really enjoyed this topic. So I think I would also like to let the audience know that if you are interested in any of the topics that you want to hear from Smriti after going through, after stalking on website and LinkedIn and everything, just send me an email, and I think that would be great because that's exactly what we need, the feedback from the audience to know what's exactly needed as well. And hopefully you've enjoyed this session, um, podcast session, and until next time. Okay.
Thank you for the conversation, Janvi.
Thank you, Smriti. All right.